I'm back.
Today is gonna be the...
Please forget the words that I just blurted out. Tom York. You don't have to ask me twice, Tom. Yeah, this one is dull. I mean, instrumentally it's nice and the production's great. It's just... Tom York, man, he's kind of boring on this. Don't get me wrong, his vocal delivery is charismatic as ever right out the gate, but his lyrics and vocal melodies are lackluster as hell, which is a shame because, like I mentioned, the instrumentals on this can be very evocative, and yet I find myself distracted by how little effort has been put into the lyrics. You know how in primary school when the teacher asks you to write the most basic sentence possible so that afterwards you can replace certain adjectives or adverbs with more sophisticated ones to create a more interesting sentence? Let's just say Tom York has yet to pass stage 1 on this album. Take what is, in my opinion, the worst example of this. Even though I might, even though I try, I can't. So many words that I can never find. If you give up on me now, I'll be gutted like I've never been before. It's just a bit weak, really, isn't it? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying lyrics have to be layered or metaphorical to some extent for me to appreciate them, but on an album whose instrumentals are so layered, the vague and nondescript nature of these lyrics offset the imagery being built up. But let's not blame it all on Tom. I mean, sometimes the instrumentals can lose me on account that they lack a certain crescendo of noise necessary in creating a chorus that hits really hard, something Radiohead would nail on future albums, which leaves me feeling sometimes as though the band are improvising without the technicality to back it up. Stop Whispering in particular takes ages to get going, and only during the outro do I find myself engaged with what's happening instrumentally. Whereas if the band had given more consideration to the structure of these songs, then it would be a much more cohesive and less awkward album for me, especially seeing as this album is blatantly trying to capitalise on the grunge scene, and yet it loses that pop-centric, radio-friendly song structure most huge grunge bands had nailed at the time. Apart from Creep, of course.
Muhammad, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Today is gonna be the...
Do not get me wrong, there is not a single bad song on this album, but the singles, in particular High and Dry, Fake Plastic Trees, and Just, are so strong to the point where they actually take away from the more structurally experimental deep cuts and make them feel forgettable, where on a more consistent album they'd fit right in. All in my opinion, of course. That aside though, there are some bangers. Songs like Planet Telex and Bones feature not only some of the breeziest instrumentation on the album, but also have choruses that hit you like a gust of wind when Tom York comes through with these yelping vocals, which brings me on to something I really like about this album, which is that we're really beginning to see Tom York's voice being utilised in different ways, all to great effect. You have the aforementioned Bones and Just, which utilise his nasal drone in making him sound, I dare say, cocky and arrogant, and then you've got the more sentimental tracks like High and Dry, Fake Plastic Trees, and Bulletproof, I Wish I Was, where he gives these beautiful, earnest, and vulnerable vocal performances which went criminally underutilised on Pablo Honey, where his vocals were more or less a straight line from start to finish. This album's production is also far better than that of its predecessor, where on Pablo Honey the quality of the songwriting didn't really make up for its lacking instrumental experimentality. Here we're beginning to see the kind of guitar work that would be the stepping stone to OK Computer's musical finesse. Having said that, this album isn't without its snoozers, whose songwriting and instrumentation never really culminate in anything memorable and sound more to me like Pablo Honey throwaways. I'm talking tracks like Sulk, Black Star, and Nice Dream, the latter of which sounds like it's going through some weird identity crisis. It starts off familiarly sedated, much like High and Dry, but then toward the latter half of the song it does a complete tonal 180, which in my opinion was such an odd choice, and it didn't even really elevate the song to a much more memorable status.
Muhammad, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Today is gonna be the...
This is as close to perfection as any band can get. Even if not every track is perfect, what I can say for certain is that this is the first Radiohead album I have heard where the lyrics, music, and vocals work seamlessly together to create an album whose tracks are both cohesive and totally distinguished from one another. The way I go about describing these songs is as though they're genres of movies, because most of them, during their seemingly short runtime, are so vocally, lyrically, and instrumentally evocative that it's as though you're being taken on a journey, nay, an emotional roller coaster. Airbag and Paranoid Android are sci-fi, Exit Music for a Film as a drama, Let Down is an action-adventure, Electioneering is a bombastic car movie, Climbing Up the Walls is a horror film, Lucky is a western. Be it coincidence or exact intention, those songs I just listed evoke just the kind of emotional response I get from watching those kinds of films, and I'm left baffled as to how Radiohead pulled it off so effortlessly. I'll nitpick and say Subterranean Homesick Alien doesn't quite live up to its title, given it feels very melodically and instrumentally Radiohead by the books when compared to the velocity of other tracks tracks on this album. Plus, The Tourist isn't much of a closer either, and despite employing similarly ethereal synth work as other tracks on this album, it never really culminates in anything grandiose like you'd hope it would. Great album overall though. I would strongly recommend it for anyone who has not listened.
Ali Muhammad, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Today is gonna be the
Well, if Radiohead's mission on OK Computer was to give every song its own distinct personality, then let's just say they took that one step further on this album. Even to the point of borderline abandoning the sound they built up on their first 3 albums to be the Radiohead we all know and love. So, does it work and do I like it? Well, let's just say it's a great album, but it certainly isn't untouchable, though I'll get to that in a bit. What I will say is that this album is chock full of surprises. When, for example, the national anthem came on, initially I was hearing traces of OK Computer, and just assumed Radiohead had detracted, albeit for one track, from the very evocative and alien sound they'd built up to that point on the album. Then I noticed about a minute in that this track possessed no real distinct instrumental nor vocal characteristics, and was very quick to boil it down to something that had been left on the cutting room floor of the OK Computer sessions. But then this awesome horn section just came thundering in, and my smug assumption was dropped within a second's notice. Not only that, but the track blew me the f*** away. Indisputably the best feature of this album, in my opinion, is the seemingly endless surprises Radiohead keep pulling from their musical hat in making these tracks go from alright to superb, which comes into play tenfold on the song How to Disappear Completely, which, if played entirely acoustically, would still have been a beautiful song in light of its majestic melody, its lyrics which are desperately in denial of themselves, and Tom York's visceral vocals. But then in comes this grandiose string section which sweeps both the song and listener alike by storm, accompanied aptly by these swelling backing vocals which just elevate the song to a whole other level entirely. I could sit here all day and pick apart every intricacy of these songs which spare them my scrutiny, be it the intensifying and ultimately climactic percussion on Optimistic, motion picture soundtrack's use of harps, or even the telephonic robot-esque vocal effect used on Kid A, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a song that lives and breathes. It is so evocative, it literally conjured up images of a little robot experiencing sunshine for the first time when I was listening to it, particularly when that heavenly synth faded into the mix. Weird of me to even bring it up, let alone in that much detail, but it's all in the name of proving how well this album did its job. Having said that, this album isn't without its flubs, which in my opinion come in the form of Tree Fingers, In Limbo, and Morning Bell, which for lack of crucifixion in the comment section I shall explain now. Tree Fingers is an instrumental which in my opinion would have worked better as an interlude on account it never really builds up to anything spectacular or even memorable in general, and for an almost 4-minute song it should have to in my opinion. My issue with the latter tracks I leave up to Idiotech to explain. Idiotech is a great song which is avant-garde as all hell and yet tremendously catchy almost in spite of itself, which is a breath of fresh air on an album whose tracks for the most part lean either one way or the other, one way being totally off the wall and surrealist, to the other way being more radio friendly and conventionally structured. Idiotech strikes the perfect balance and proves that both can be achieved in tandem with one another and to great effect, which leads me on to my issues with In Limbo and Morning Bell, which is that although they're as experimental as the other songs, there is, for lack of a better term, no song there. I actually found myself agitated by Tom York's vocals on In Limbo in particular, which are neither here nor there, and was similarly disgruntled by the song's abundant need for any kind of musical variation as it drones repetitively on and on. Not that these issues detract from the album overall, they're just things I felt could have been easily avoided with just a little extra effort.
Ali Muhammad, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Today is gonna be the
Why do bands think it's a good idea to release songs that weren't good enough to appear on their previous album as an album of its own? For those of you who don't know, the songs on Amnesiac were recorded in the same sessions as Kid A, and presumably were left off Kid A on account they didn't fit cohesively in with that album sonically. So why then would you assume that they would work cohesively as an album of their own? It's just lazy in my opinion. And that's not dismissing this album altogether. I mean, the opening few tracks were setting me up for something that I expected was going to be like Kid A, but with less emphasis on considered musical choices and more emphasis on groove and accessibility while maintaining that angular production. I was digging it, especially packed like sardines in a crushed tin box, and I might be wrong. Songs whose sedated vocal delivery and laid-back instrumentation I found reminiscent of Demon Days era Gorillaz, which I love. love. Even Pyramid Song and You and Whose Army, while differing greatly in tone from the two tracks I just mentioned, weren't distractingly so, on account that they're just great songs with the kind of climactic attributes that made Kid A great. Thus, while I understand for one reason or another why Radiohead chose not to include these tracks on Kid A, it pains me to have to rag on an album with underdogs such as these on it. Having said all that, some tracks on here do read less like tracks written with purpose, and more like tracks whose sole existence are an endeavour in discovering what kind of sound Radiohead wanted to approach Kid A with. Soundscapes, for lack of a better term. Specifically like spinning plates, dollars and cents, and revolving doors, the latter of which borders on jokingly unnoteworthy, disregarding the lyrics, which, metaphorical or otherwise, sound like the ramblings of a toddler. Then you've got Knives Out, which oddly enough sounds like an OK Computer throwaway, with its production and instrumentation coming not even close to mirroring anything on Kid A, and its vocal melody being heavily reminiscent of Paranoid Android. And then you've got Hunting Bears, a track which, as far as I'm concerned, stabbed my expectations in the back given the magnitude of that title. It's a goddamn jam session, what the fuck was it doing on this? It's not even catchy. Radiohead really seemed to toe the line between music that's experimental and music that's of any merit on this record, even going as far as to feature an albeit prettier version of a track that's already on Kid A. If that doesn't hint that they weren't taking this album all too serious, then I don't know what will.
Ali Muhammad, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Today is gonna be the
Honestly, of all the gripes I have with this album, Tom York's voice is top of the list. Some of these tracks are instrumentally bone dry and so lenient on his singing, which, in all honesty, seems to have hit a brick wall on this album, where he kind of just washes, rinses, and repeats the same few vocal phrases and melodies over and over. At least that's what it sounds like. Remember how in my The Benz review I mentioned that album's explorative use of Tom York's voice and how dynamic it can be when used properly? Needless to say, on this album they really hit home that Tom York is great at going... Comparatively, there's so much less to fixate on, where in almost every aspect of these songs, the band seem to want to prioritise being different, which gets so tedious and ironically predictable after a while. At least find a healthy balance of that stuff with the accessibility, catchiness, and groove that made albums like OK Computer and Kid A so popular. And that's not to say there aren't exceptions. Where I End and You Begin and Myxomatosis are shining examples of the Radiohead I love, driving beat, meaty bass line, ethereal vocals with aptly spacey synthesized instrumentation, whereas on other tracks off this album I found Radiohead were recycling tropes of past songs, only with less substance. For example, my notes for The Gloaming read, not yet another track with synthesized percussion, a minimalist chord sequence, and looming yet ultimately uneventful vocal performance over the top of it. Another example being my notes for We Suck Young Blood, which once again read, not yet another piano-based track with annoyingly elongated vocal phrases and a melody that sounds uninspired to the point of self-parody over the top of it. Which brings me on to my next point, which is that a majority of these tracks start out deceitfully dull before bursting into a bombardment of colourfully arranged instrumental breaks, something Radiohead utilised to great success on Kid A. The difference though is that on Kid A I wasn't falling asleep beforehand. It feels to me like instead of this technique being used as an endeavour in strengthening an already interesting song, instead Radiohead seemed to use it as a saving grace on this album. And sure, the songs are better for it, but introduce those switch-ups earlier on and layer them gradually so the song culminates in something epic. Don't just phone it in last minute and expect my opinion on the song overall to have changed.
Ali Muhammad, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
today is gonna be the
4 years between this album and Hail to the Thief were much needed in my opinion, as this album comes right out the gate sounding fresh and with its own unique identity, no longer riding the OK Computer / Kid A train in its songwriting process. No, this album is much looser, less calculated, and most significantly more grassroots in its instrumental approach. It certainly feels as though the band recognised the forced nature of their previous album's experimentation and decided to take a step back and write songs that were more true to their musical inclinations, with every member using their instrument of interest to the best of their ability. I heard glimpses of the Benz and even Pablo Honeygan here without improvisational some of the jazzier moments on this album can feel, but with the instrumental capability to carry it off this time around. In many ways I'd consider this album Radiohead's Remain in Light by Talking Heads, in that the instrumentals, particularly that of the former half of the album, are also multi-layered and textured without ever biting off more than they can chew. On top of that, Tom York's vocal takes on this are much more inspired and in line with the tonality the rest of the band bring to the table, unlike before. His use of backing vocals on House of Cards and Jigsaw Falling into Place almost act as another layer of instrumentation and work effortlessly in giving those beautiful songs a soulful climactic finish. Not to mention this album's adventurous use of percussion, production, particularly on 15 Step and Reckoner, which create immediate intrigue and set the listener up effectively for a song with hampers of personality. The whole album is a thoroughly enjoyable listen, though some tracks overstay their welcome more than others. Faust Arp was a track I felt, if anything, was a couple minutes too short, whereas Weird Fishes / Arpeggi felt quite vague and nondescript for being one of the longer tracks on the album.
Ali Muhammad. I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Today is gonna be the
Where on Radiohead's previous album every track felt refreshingly loose and structurally unbound, this album takes that motif one step further and is even more minimalist in its approach, with the band honing their skills in creating these tight-knit riffs, grooves and vocal hooks which carry the songs effortlessly along through the course of their unnoticeably lengthy runtime. It's certainly an album to be experienced as 8 songs, as admittedly there aren't all too many standouts, but that doesn't matter on account this album stands among Radiohead's more thematically consistent work in my opinion. I actually found myself struggling to write notes as the album progressed, given the laid-back nature of it all and how inclined I felt to just lose myself in it. I was bored not a single time despite the repetitious nature of a majority of these songs, which just goes to prove how understated this band is in delivering earworms in an albeit unconventional manner.
Ali Muhammad. I'd like to say the word, damn it!
today is gonna be the
I'm not gonna lie, given the thematic consistency of their last album, I went into this one with the expectation that there would be some kind of through-running gimmick here as well, and was pleasantly surprised to find each track had its own unique identity. Clearly on this occasion Radiohead prioritised the songs as standalone tracks as opposed to a cohesively flowing album, which is fine, it just struck me as confusing upon first listen given the immediacy and intensity of track 1, Burn the Witch, whose harkening orchestral element sounded to me unlike anything Radiohead had ever done before, followed weirdly by Daydreaming, who, in spite being among the dreamier, more evocative and mystical tracks of Radiohead's discography, caught me so off guard with how comparatively laid back it is in contrast with track 1. Nonetheless, this album has some gorgeous songs, consistent or otherwise, most of which feature either strings or piano and utilise them in such a way that complement Tom York's singing beautifully. This album takes its time too and allows the listener to gain a sense of familiarity and fondness of the song before throwing a total curveball of awesomeness in your face, be it the unorthodox and yet complementary layers of guitar that round off Identikit, or the howling backing vocals toward the back end of Present Tense. Even tracks I didn't find captivating from start to finish I was able to seek salvation in through either their breakdown or outro where inevitably something interesting musically happens, be it the twisted plinky plonk piano on Dex Dark or the unexpectedly catchy Oh the Good Times hook on Full Stop.
Ali Muhammad. I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Whew, alright, and here's the ranking coming at you in 3, 2, 1. Well, thank you for watching, everyone. I know it's been a long time coming, and by a long time, I mean 2 years. Is it 2 years? I think it might be a year and a half, possibly 2 years by the time this video actually shows its face on YouTube. Believe it or not, and you would have every right to not believe me, I do have every intent to carry this series on, so do feel free to leave a suggestion in the comments. I have taken down every suggestion that has been made thus far. Weezer has been quite a popular suggestion, which is deeply unnerving. So yeah, take it easy, and I'll see you next time for... The Libertines. Yeah, I'm wondering what the point is as well. See you next week. Voice crack.